Incident at Hawks Hill by Alan W. Eckert. Chapter 6. For 3 days after returning to her burrow with the prairie dog, the female badger remained within the den, alternately nursing her pups, cleaning them, and eating the remainder of her prey. As all badgers are, she was fastidious about the condition of the den. Bones, feathers, bits of fur, and other such residue were always buried well beneath the floor level of the emergency exit tunnel. And when the baby badgers defecated, neither often nor much, she would quickly consume their waste and gently cleanse them with her tongue. She gave no indication of distaste for the chore and even appeared to gain a certain nutrient value from it. Without her ability to perform this act, the den would soon have become unbearably messy, and would have reeked with the stench of such awful and body wastes. Her own waste she always contained within her until she was far from the den. Even then she would dig a hole in which to deposit them, and then cover them over with dirt and debris. The only exception to this was when she was coming into her season, at which time she would leave the waste exposed, so that the odor of it, mingled with musk from her scent glands, would attract a male. A male badger could detect and follow up such a scent from as far distant as 7 or 8 miles. But now, at the beginning of her 4th consecutive night in the den with her pups, and with the prairie dog remains long since consumed, she felt the stirrings of hunger. She licked the 3 sightless babies thoroughly, and though they began squirming into position to nurse again, she nudged them away with her snout and left the den, wheezing softly. As always, she paused at the entrance and emerged slowly, cautiously, listening and sniffing for possible danger. The breeze from the northeast was fresh and bore no sound or scent of hazard, and so she came out all the way. There she stood upright on her hind legs and looked around carefully, especially toward the downwind direction from whence scent might not have reached her, and sounds might not have carried. Again there was no evidence of danger, and without further delay she dropped to all fours and began her flowing gait toward the southwest. She had traveled no more than 100 feet when she stopped abruptly, and her nose tilted upward, sniffing. There it was again, the same strange and compelling odor she had detected on her way back to the den with the prairie dog. Without hesitation now, she turned to follow it, and the scent trail led her more or less back toward the den. At about 60 feet from the entrance, the smell was very heavy, and she detected that it was coming from the ground, directly in front of her. Camouflaged though it was, she could see that something had been buried there, something that smelled extremely enticing. Still, her natural caution made her suspicious, and she circled the area several times, ignoring the big slab of grass-cloaked rock nearby, and concentrating her attention on the area of ground emanating the odor. Her circles grew smaller, her caution less, though her suspicions were not entirely allayed. At last she stopped with her nose directly over the spot, whining with excitement stirred by the aroma. She reached her right front paw out gingerly and scratched the surface of the ground. It was loose, and her claws pulled away the grassy debris scattered over the top. Again she reached out and sunk her claws in a little farther, and drew her foreleg in. A dirt-covered fleshy object, slender and 2 or 3 inches in length, was pulled free. She smelled it, licked it hesitantly, then snatched it up in her mouth and wolfed it down. The heavy, oily taste excited her tremendously. It was fish, but of a kind she had never eaten before. With a somewhat less suspicious eagerness, she reached out with the same paw to expose some more. The great claws dug in. She felt them touch more of the fish, but at the same time she detected a faint give to the ground, as if it was sinking her ever so slightly under the weight of her paw. Instantly, instinctively, she jerked back. Her reflexes were incredibly swift, but not quite swift enough. Even as she recoiled, the steel jaws erupted from the ground. They snapped close, catching not her whole paw well up onto the lower leg as was intended, but imprisoning the 2 outer toes of her right front foot. The bone in the outermost toe snapped at the impact, but the other did not. The jaws of the trap gripped these toes well in, almost to where they joined the paw, and the pain was excruciating for the badger. Growling, shrieking, snarling, she lunged and thrashed and tore up the area. But the grip of those steel jaws was not to be broken. She bit at the trap itself, at the chain running from its end, at the heavy wire attaching it to the slab of rock, even at the rock itself, but all to no avail. Thus began a period of incomparable agony and anguish. Time after time she fought the trap until exhaustion made her stop and lie panting and wheezing. She would rest then, constantly licking her paw, trying vainly to ease the throbbing pain in the now badly swollen toes. Both had enlarged to twice normal size, making it that much more unlikely that she would be able to pull herself free. Off and on throughout the night, and the day and the night that followed, she alternately struggled and rested, and by the dawning of the second morning, all she had accomplished was to drag the slab of rock about 40 feet closer to the entrance of the den than it had been in the beginning. That was when the real anguish began, for now she could faintly hear the mewing cries of her hungry pups deep in the burrow. All young animals have great need to be fed regularly and often, and the baby badgers were no exception. If the nourishing milk of the mother was denied them for long, they quickly weakened. Now they were at the very peak of their hunger, and just as she could hear their cries, so too could they hear her struggles and whining, the growls and scuffling that accompanied her efforts to get free. And knowing it was her, the young ones cried all the more loudly and scrambled about in blind bewilderment in the den chamber, unable to understand why she did not come to them, unable yet to go themselves to her. All through that day, too, she fought the trap, spurred on with a greater desperation by the voices of her young reaching her. Inch by painful inch, she managed to move the heavy slab closer to the den, until by nightfall she was no more than 10 feet from the entrance. It was as close as she could come. The rock had now become so entangled with the long grasses that she could no longer budge it, and though her struggling persisted all through the third night, not another inch was gained. Over 20 miles away, in a Winnipeg saloon, George Burton sat in a card game, trying to parlay his gains from the hide of the female badger's mate into a much tidier sum, but thus far only barely holding his own. If he gave any thought to this trap in which the female badger was now weakening in her struggles, he gave no sign of it. As usual, he would check his trap line when he got around to it. By sunup of the third morning of her imprisonment, the female badger could detect a change in the cries from her pups. They were uttered less frequently, and were considerably weaker than they had been. By mid-afternoon she could hear them only a little at long intervals, and by nightfall there was only quiet. During that fourth night in the trap she struggled hardly at all. Her own strength had badly failed, and her tongue was thick from lack of water. In the morning, just after dawn, she heard one of her pups cry weakly, briefly. It seemed to trigger in her a last great burst of energy. She had been lying at this point on the back side of the rock slab, with it between her and her burrow. Now she lunged to her feet and raced for the hole with all her strength. The shock when she came to the end of the slack of the chain and wire was tremendous. It flipped her completely over and slammed her onto her back with such force that a huge wheezing expulsion of breath was forced from her. It did something else, too. It broke the bone of the second imprisoned toe. Now all that held the greatly distended digits in the trap was a little bit of muscle tissue, tendons and tautly stretched skin. And it was to this now, once she recovered, that she directed her attention. She began to gnaw on her own flesh, nipping it away particle by particle, whining and grunting with her efforts. Still the sun was at its zenith before the final strained white tendon parted and the female badger was free. Ignoring the continuing pain in her foot, she hastened down the burrow to the den, whining loudly to let the pups know of her coming. There was no response. They were lying still on the den floor when she got there, and when she touched her nose to the first, the little one was stiff and cold. The second, a little male, was warm and soft, and he moved a little when she nudged him. The third, like the first, was dead. She turned her full attention to the little male, licking him and chattering softly. She rolled over, exposing her badly swollen nipples to him, but the little one was so weak he could not even hold up his head for more than just a second or two. She moaned more and maneuvered so the nipple was pressing against his snout. Once or twice he tried to feed, but he was just too weak. He could not hold himself upright enough, could not grasp the nipple tightly enough, had not even the strength to suck. By nightfall, he too was dead. The female badger nuzzled them for a while longer, but after an hour or so she gave up. Moving to the emergency escape shaft, she tore at the tunneling until it collapsed and sealed itself, and then backing from the main entrance, she paused a foot or so from the den chamber and plugged the passageway in a similar manner. It was an instinctive maneuver, done mechanically with no real understanding on her part of why she did it. Not infrequently, she had done the same thing, even when abandoning a temporary den. Occasionally, especially in winter, she would plug an entrance while she was inside, and thereby benefit from the added warmth and protection this afforded. She headed due south after leaving the den, evidently intent on traveling far away from this tragic place. The throbbing in her damaged foot, however, intensified with every mile covered until she was hobbled badly, and no longer able even to touch the forepaw to the ground. And so, though she had covered less than 5 miles, she began to look for a place to hole up. Digging a temporary den was out of the question. There was no alternative except to seek out one of her old abandoned burrows, and remain there until she had recovered her strength, and her wound had healed. She raised her head above the grasses and looked about her. There was a familiar jumble of protruding rocks a short distance ahead of her, and a series of low rolling knolls. One of them, Hawks Hill. Vaguely in the moonlight to the east, the landmarks oriented her, and now she struck off slightly to the southwest. Within another half-mile she found what she had been seeking, one of her own excavations of more than a year ago, close to another of the outcroppings of rock. It was a large hole, even larger than her den hole had been, though the tunneling here was not as extensive as that of the one she had just abandoned. The entry, fairly well hidden by grasses, was adjacent to a large, flat, somewhat basin-shaped rock, upon which, during the time she had resided there, she had sometimes stretched out to bask in the sun. The hole angled down for over 6 feet before leveling off, and continuing another 8 feet to the chamber. This chamber was a great deal larger than the den chamber she had so recently dug. The fact that it was so big was not really of her doing. Whether by accident or design, she had tunneled directly toward the rock pile, and into a hollow pocket in the earth that had evidently been formed in some bygone age by the upheaval of these rocks, 2 of which had touched ends and pushed upwards against each other. The resultant hollow beneath them was cone-shaped, with a base diameter of about 8 feet, and a height to the peak of the cone of more than 7 feet. Moonlight shone in dimly through several chinks at the top, where the rocks met imperfectly, but there were no large holes. No more than 2 feet from where the entrance tunnel emerged into this hollow, the emergency tunnel left it. She followed this the 20 feet it ran before angling to the surface. Upon reaching the opening, she cautiously poked her head above ground. The moon was gone now, hidden behind a blanket of low, heavy clouds that had just moved in. The smell of a rainstorm coming was in the air, and the grasses seemed to tremble and whisper among themselves in anticipation. As with the front entry, the grasses here at the emergency exit had grown right to the very lip of the hole, perfectly camouflaging it. Rather than disturb them and mash them down by moving outside to turn around, she simply backed down the tunnel to the big chamber. Satisfied that she would be safe here for the time being, she lay down and licked her injured foot briefly. It was difficult for her to do, since the injury was to the outer portion of the foot, and she had to bend down neck and forepaw in order to reach it adequately. The pain this caused was too much, and so she soon ceased her efforts. Though she had slaked her severe thirst at a pothole en route to this den, hunger remained strong in her. Even more than satisfying this hunger, however, she needed to rest, to recuperate somewhat from her strenuous exertions of the past days and nights in the trap. She curled up to sleep, tucking her nose under her tail, her long fur tending to stand erect because of the way she was curled and making her look like some fuzzy, well-stuffed cushion. She slept deeply, wheezing gently as she breathed. It seemed incredible that in so short a time she had lost her mate, lost her den, lost her pups, and even lost a portion of her right front foot. She was still in considerable pain, and her mammary glands were uncomfortably swollen with milk, which would now remain undrunk. But she would survive. As is common in nature, the instinct for survival is amazingly strong. And that's the end of chapter 6.